We met rather accidentally 3 weeks ago on Facebook. Yes, I know. One shouldn't add everyone to their friends list. I've learned my lesson. So we had the same hobby, and it turned out we had the same interests. So when he asked me to go out for a coffee, I said yes. We met, and he was a pretty normal guy for the first 5 minutes. Then he took my hand, which felt strange to me. Where I come from, people have respect for others' personal space. Yeah, I know, those fucking cold Scandinavians. But I considered it normal where I live now. He asked if I felt comfortable with it, and I said no. But he would take my hand over and over again. 10 minutes later, he was following me down the street as I was rushing angrily to the subway and apologizing and almost crying. I felt pity. He seemed to be a nice guy, only without any experience with women. So I decided to still give him a second chance. He was pretty nice, as I said, and we shared common interests. So we went for a walk. He tried to hug me, and when it got clear that I don't want to hug someone I've known for less than 2 hours, he apologized, only to try to grab my ass less than a minute later. I hit him, asking me why I didn't get away immediately. He apologized again, but did it again soon. I really wanted to shoot him by this time, but said goodbye in the most polite way possible and caught the first subway, even though it was not in my direction. Until then, a pretty unusual story, huh? I wish it would have ended up with me catching the wrong subway and getting home, taking a shower, making dinner, continuing to work on another project. I'm pretty happy to be able to do home office, so I can stay in the flat without needing to go out if I don't want to. Then turning on some music and eventually going to bed. But it was not meant to end up like that. That night he called me. I had no idea how he got my number. I'd never given it to him nor submitted it on Facebook. I came out with the excuse that I had work to do and promised to stay in touch, but had it in mind to ignore him. 2 days after it, I was awakened by the doorbell early in the morning. He was standing in front of my door. I have no fucking idea how he got my address. I slammed the door, but he remained there crying. So I came outside to ask him what he wanted. He explained that he had fallen in love, which I dismissed given that he had only met me a couple of days ago and seen me only once. He had sent me some messages which I had read and ignored. I thought he only wanted to sleep with me, but I had found out he suffered from a disorder that did not allow him to have any sexual intercourse. I believe he has a mental disorder as well. So I sent him home and again promised to stay in touch out of pity. And then it began. He would text me all the time, sending over 100 messages per hour. I had to put his number in the reject list of my phone. Every day I would swear I see him about 50 meters away from me. The guy went so far he would tell all his friends and relatives I was his girlfriend. He would wait for me to get home from work one day and take my hand and take me for a walk downtown, holding so tightly that I couldn't get away. He took me to a restaurant, ordered dinner for 2, and didn't stop talking about his plans for us to marry and to visit my family back in Norway. He even knew how our children would be called. I insisted on going to the bathroom. He let me. Then I headed to the bathrooms, but turned left in the last moment and escaped through the back door. Luckily, I had my bag with me and my keys and my phone were in there, so I didn't have to worry who would be able to break into my apartment. This was 3 days ago. Today, he stood in front of the house for almost 4 hours, ringing on the doorbell, texting and calling me. Someone let him in the house, unaware of the situation, and he spent another hour in front of my door. He wept, cried, shouted, offended me, apologized, blamed me for ruining his life, declared that I was the love of his life, sang some ballads, threatened to rip me apart, and everything all over again. I sat in the corner, listening and holding a kitchen knife, afraid that he would try to get in. I was in panic. Only after an hour had passed, I got the courage to call the police. When the cops arrived, he had vanished. Yet some hours after they had gone, I saw him down in the garden, but he hid again when he saw my face from the window. He is still there, and I'm afraid. I'm not telling this to creep people out. I just felt the need to share it. So I am a college freshman in the South. I'm also a female. Before I begin this story, I'd like to give a description of myself. I'm a short, chubby black female. When I say short, I believe I am just underneath the average height, 5'4". Anyway, my college was across the street from a run-down gas station, where I happened to work. On a night that I was working, my boss left me alone for the night because he hadn't gotten any sleep. Or so that is what he said. But it was a pretty slow day. There wasn't a specific reason why it was slow, it just was. Anyway, I was playing Geometry Dash on my phone as I sat behind the counter. It wasn't a counter with the thick glass and speaking tube. It was just a regular counter. As I played my game, I heard the door open, with the little chime from the bells. I looked up to see a man, about average height and very skinny, but for some reason a little intimidating. I was never the one to be afraid of anyone, so when I say he was intimidating, he was. He was balding with a little comb over. He had on a dingy white t-shirt with holes and dad jeans that were caked in a dark red substance and mud. He seemed as if he had just went hunting, but I'm not sure. He looked at me. His eyes were hollow and empty. But still, I smiled. "Hello, how are you?" Common southern hospitality. He muttered something, I couldn't hear him, and went to the back of the store. I watched him for a while before I eventually had gotten bored and went back to my game. After about a minute of aggravation, I clicked off the game and went to scroll down Instagram. When I glanced up, he was standing behind the aisle, just watching me. Upon reflex, I put my head back down, looking at my phone, but something told me to look back up. When I did, he was standing at the counter, holding gummy worms and a beer. Did you find everything okay, sir?" I say, a little startled, but I was okay. He didn't say anything. He just dug through his pockets and pulled out a dirty $10 bill. The total is $5.68, I say, as I grabbed the money, smiling at him. After I handed him back his change, out of nowhere he shouts, "I hate all you N-words. You and the damn wetbacks." Taken aback by his comment, I couldn't say anything. I was just stunned. "Aw, you don't got nothing to say, huh? You N-words always have something to say. Never know when to shut your damn mouths. I swear to God, if I could hang you, I would." I gasped. I was about to tell him to get his fucking worms and can of spit and get the fuck out. I call beers a can of spit with pennies in it because that's what it tastes like. But a few college guys burst through the damn door, alerting the both of us. He grabbed his shit and walked out. Luckily, I knew one of the college students. "Hey there," he smiled, bringing me some Doritos and an Arizona iced tea. I guess the look on my face gave him an idea of how I was feeling. "You okay?" he asked. I shook my head. No, that man that walked out said he wished he could hang me. He started off with these racist comments. I didn't even do anything, I told him. I wasn't crying. I was just really mad. My friend asked me if he should go look for him. I told him no. "I'll be fine," I assured him. He nodded and asked for a pen and paper. I ripped a piece of receipt paper off and handed him the counter pen. "Okay, call me if you need me," he says, writing his phone number down. His other friends came around with a bunch of food, and after that, they were on their way. After about 2 hours or so, my boss and another co-worker came in, which means that I was off. I gathered my things, forgetting about the whole incident, and told them good day. I left and began my journey across the street. After about a good mile or so, I heard someone yell, "Hey, sir, is there a reason for you to be here tonight?" I looked back to see campus security talking to a lanky man. My eyes began to focus into the darkness when I noticed it was a racist guy from the station. His eyes were locked on me, and it made me even more uncomfortable. He didn't respond, which made it menacing enough for me to leave. I began to walk quicker to my dorm and just forget about the whole thing. He was caught. I was okay. Nothing else happened. The next day in the Union Center, I was doing some homework at a table and listening to some music when the guy that I know sat down. "Hey, I'm glad you made it back okay." He smiles. I nodded. "Yeah, thanks." He sighs. "Because they found some guy on the campus last night with a pistol and hunting knife." My stomach dropped when he said that. It was this skinny white man. He kept mumbling some petty racist shit under his breath. "So I thought that was the guy that you told me about last night." He finished. I told him that I think it was, and that he was following me back to my dorm last night. As I thought, he was also stunned for words. "So fucked up, racist, dickhead, weirdo, let's not meet, okay?" This incident happened when I was about 11, nearly 12. Now for a bit of background information. At that age I had already started developing early on, so I would get unwanted attention from adult males. At the time I never understood why, and I only wore shirts under my clothes instead of a usual training bra so things weren't that visible, though you could still kinda see. The area I lived in at the time wasn't the best, but due to my mother being a single parent and only having one source of income, this is where I called home. It was a seemingly presentable looking apartment complex on the outside, though the residents who lived there knew it was anything but. We lived there in total of 3 years. though due to the rising incidents that happened to us, we were forced to move. When we first moved in, crime in this area was not a problem, so we wouldn't sweat it. And to mention that there were a lot of children in the complex, so I thought, hey, nothing bad could happen over here. It's a family place. It's completely safe. Having this state of mind, I would usually go outside to sit on our front porch during the summers to play with my dog when I got bored in the house. Where I live, it gets extremely hot during this time, so I had on a tank top and shorts. I remember it was around 5:30 p.m. and it seemed to be completely still outside. It seemed as though no one was out, so it was just me and my puppy. He was about 2 at the time. Now to me, he was extremely protective and very alert. Sadly, I was not. As I was wrestling with him, I hear a rustle in the bushes about 10 feet away from me, to the right. But I pay it no mind and continue to play with him, though now my puppy seems very tense. About 5 minutes later, I hear it again, and so does he, but this time he loses his playful spirit and goes into full-on guard mode. Ears perked, chest poked out, and eyes scanning. Now please understand something. I was always a very timid child. If I heard anything, I damn sure was not about to go investigate it. My mother was upstairs asleep since she worked night shifts, and due to this, I didn't want to bother her. Though she didn't know I was outside anyway. I see no matter how much I try to get him to keep playing, he just won't budge. I turn to where he's looking, and I see a man. Very rough looking, but I knew I had seen him before, and he must have lived in the complex. He had a dirty wife beater that looked beer-stained, dark blue jeans, and work boots. He was standing behind the bush next to the building staring at me. I saw his hand moving rapidly, and at the time I had no idea what he was doing. I now know what he was doing behind that bush. All the while he was doing this, he was muttering something under his breath and tried to take a step forward, closer to me. But instead of me running, I was frozen. My dog at this point let out the most vicious growl and snarled at this man, which snapped me out of my frozen state immediately, and I screamed for my mother, running up the stairs as quickly as I could. When I got up the stairs, she had heard me and quickly rushed to me, though I didn't want to worry her, knowing she had to work that night. So I just brushed it off with some excuse and sent her back off to bed. I thought this was over. Wrong again. Fast forward to about 3 days later, and my feeble mind had forgotten about the incident, but I didn't go back outside alone. It was nighttime now, and me and my mom had come back from one of her mommy-daughter days at the movies. It was around 12:30, and we had just gotten home. Me, being hyped up on cotton candy and sodas, was off my guard again, though my mother was not. I always joke with her about how, even now, she has the hearing of a dog, though I didn't know it would come in handy tonight. One thing about my mother is she wasn't very threatening, standing at only 5'5", though she had lots of muscle in her from working on the ambulance as an EMT. Another thing is, regardless of where she was, she always had a switchblade that she could pop out faster than lightning if she needed to. As we shut the car off, we both noticed that the streetlight illuminating our building was off. We both looked at each other in a what-the-fuck realization. It was pitch black now, though every other light was on in front of the other buildings but ours. Me being scary, this knocked out all the hyper feelings I had. I was not attentive. As I was getting out of the car, I noticed that I heard a rustle behind the bushes like I had heard 3 days ago. I stopped dead in my tracks outside of the car and looked at my mother without speaking, asking her, "Did you hear that?" Though only through my eyes. She never misses a beat. Her eyes were already trained on the bushes to my right. Deciding to play it cool like we didn't hear them, we continued to get our bags out of the car. As we shut them, it seemed time stood still. The pathway for us to get to our building was Y-shaped, and the realization hit that this person was literally 5 feet away from me, dressed in all black with a hoodie on and hands in his pockets. I could feel the ill intent meant for us. As we got to the front of our car, I looked at her and she looked at me, knowing this meant, on the count of 3, run. By now my heart was beating out of my chest, and on 3 I booked it to the front door and threw it open, running quickly up our steps, running with key in hand. Though I ran with my mother behind me, I could hear a third pair of feet were running too. I had cleared 5 feet between me and the door, and about 20 steps in 10 seconds with my mother in tow. Since our door to the building was incredibly hard to open once slammed, she shut it tightly behind her, waking up my sleeping dog upstairs in the process, and he started barking like crazy. I could hear the door handle jiggling, trying to be forced open as me and my mother finally stepped in our apartment. We heard the building door slam open and footsteps running up through. By this time the door was locked and barricaded. My dog growled and jumped at the door, and in hearing this, I think scared whoever was there away, because all that was heard was retreating footsteps out of the building and around the side of the building into a very thick brush. We called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do about it. I even told my mom, finally, of the man I saw, and she knew who he was. Let's just say I had to stop her from popping a cap in his ass and getting locked up, since the police told us to mind our business and get used to it since, and I quote, using his words, "Women should be in the house anyway." My encounter took place in the early spring last year. The evenings had started to get a little lighter, so providing I left work on time, I get to see that last little bit of light. Sadly, I am a nurse working at the local hospital, so leaving on time is rare. Anyway, on this particular day, there had been an emergency on the ward, and I ended up leaving about an hour and a half later than I should have. I walked out the back entrance of the hospital, near where they bring all the deliveries, as I always do, and I noticed a man standing in the middle of the road smoking. Now, this alone didn't really cause me to be worried, as this entrance leads straight to a residential area, and assumed he was visiting someone with a no smoking policy in their house. It was about 10 p.m., very dark, and so all I could make out was the fact that he was a man with dark hair, thanks to the streetlight a little further down the street. As I walked closer, all I could smell was the cigarette he was smoking, and could see him attempting to sneak glances at me. This made me a little uncomfortable, but I figured I was obviously doing the same thing to him for me to notice this in the first place. So I put my big girl pants on, kept my eyes averted, and walked past him. As I turned left onto another residential street, with a huge park on the other side of the road, to me, I could smell cigarette smoke again. I glanced behind me, and guess who was there? The same guy, still smoking away. He gave me a creepy smile and put his cigarette out on the pavement. I'd like to mention that he had managed to come up behind me and be at arm's length without me even noticing. I'd like to put it down to how stealthy and fast he had crept up on me, but the reality is I just wasn't paying attention. After a 13-hour shift, I was exhausted, and as a nurse, I always think back to what had happened at work. Did I do the right thing? If I had done something different, would a certain patient's outcome be different? Had I told the family of the man with terminal cancer the right way? So you see, I was too wrapped up in my own thoughts. Walking a route I had taken 1,000 times. That, combined with the fact that it only takes me about 15 minutes to get home, I had managed to convince myself I was safe. Anyway, I decided to still give this guy the benefit of the doubt by slowing my pace so that he could pass me on the pavement. But he just slowed down to match. This is when the alarm bells really started ringing. I should mention that my route home involves an alley that has only 2 streetlights that never work, and is rather narrow, allowing only one person to walk down it at any one time. It runs along the back of more residential streets, and mine is the second one you come to. I kept glancing behind me, and he was still walking close to me and smiling. I sped up my pace, so did he. I slowed again, and he does exactly the same. Now I'm freaking the fuck out. I was getting closer to the alley that I always walk down, and needed to decide fast if I was going to risk that way, or should I carry on down this road, which is pretty long, to a fairly main road at the end. When I say main road, it's just a road that leads to the town centre that has a few shops along it that are all closed by this time at night, and the odd car driving along it. While I was trying to decide what way to go, I know, only idiots take an alley when they think they're being followed. I felt him touch my arm and try to pull me around to face him. By now, I was only a few steps away from the alley, so I yanked my arm from his grip and ran like a bat out of hell down this alley. The first streetlight, that is at the top of the first road, wasn't working. And I know what you're thinking. I should have ran down that road and knocked on someone's door for help. But all I could think about was getting home and being able to put a locked door between me and this guy. I could hear him running after me, his feet hitting the ground and his breathing behind me. Now, like I said, I always walk this way, and the left side has big bushes, trees and weeds, etc., that get so overgrown that they start taking over the walkway. I knew that one of the tree's branches had grown over, and while I was short enough to run under it without incident, I was praying he wasn't. He was starting to gain on me, and I knew I was getting tired and slowing. People always talk about how in these kinds of situations they get a huge adrenaline rush and can run for ages to get out of harm's way. Not sure if I'm just missing that, or if I was just too tired to keep going for that long. I'm still going, and feel the tree branch brush the top of my head, and about 5 seconds later, I hear it smack into him, and he starts shouting and swearing. I am not at all far from where the alley meets the top of my road. Thankfully, the light is working here, so I can see clearly. I can hear his footfalls getting closer as I run down my road. I live about halfway down, and as I reach my house, I realize I can't hear him anymore. So naturally, I do another stupid thing. I slow right down and turn around. He was standing under the streetlight, with the same creepy smile on his face, and waves. That undid me completely. I'm crying like a baby now, and trying to catch my breath as I fight the lock on my door, but eventually get into my house and lock it again. I close the curtains downstairs and take the knife from the kitchen upstairs with me and my dogs. Thankfully, nothing else happened. He didn't make a move to follow me when I turned to look at him, but I didn't want to be unprepared if he changed his mind. I'd also like to add I live in the middle of a row of terraced houses that all look the same, so the chances of him finding my house again would be very unlikely. I have no idea what he was going to do to me, if anything. He could have just got a kick out of freaking me the fuck out. I never reported it to the police, but a few weeks later, I read in our local paper about a man who tried to attack another woman 4 streets away from me. They caught the guy, but I never knew if it was the same person. If it was, then I am truly sorry for not going to the police, as I could have stopped that happening to her. So, Creepy Smiler, let's not meet again. My parents' house is modest but nice for the area it's in the north of England. When they chose the place back in the late 80s, they did so because it faces out onto a huge field, and in that area, greenery is in short supply. At the edge of the field, directly opposite their front door and window, is a dense line of old trees. During the day, they make for a beautiful view. At night, they realized fairly quickly that the darkness just beyond those trees can be quite creepy. Not long after they moved in, they were burgled, and were told by the police that in all likelihood, the burglars had been watching the house from that tree line for days to learn their routine and wait for an opening due to a clear knowledge of the house's layout. After that, my father installed a house alarm. In the early 2000s, he installed CCTV and a floodlight activated by motion sensors after a series of robberies in the area and some trouble with a group of local kids. The camera on the front captures their small garden, the dozen or so steps leading to the street, and a decent amount of the street beyond it. The floodlight normally activates if anybody gets anywhere past halfway down the steps. I went back to stay with my parents in autumn 2015 while I waited for my new apartment to be ready. They hadn't had any trouble from those kids for a long time, and there had been no reports of robberies in the area for about as long. Generally, it's the kind of place I'd walk at night without giving it a second's thought. Around 11 p.m. on my first night there, my father was out at work, and I was watching TV in the front room with my mother. Out of nowhere, there was a loud bang on the front window. I got up and went outside to investigate, and was annoyed to find that the floodlight wasn't working. Lying in front of the window was a huge pile of dirt and rocks that somebody had obviously thrown from the front street. I looked up and down the street but couldn't see anything. I looked out towards the line of darkened trees and again, nothing. But have you ever had one of those weird feelings, like there are eyes on you that you can't see? I couldn't shake it. After going back inside, I asked my mother if I should go check the CCTV recording, and she explained that it had stopped working years beforehand. But they'd left the very obvious camera housing in place as a deterrent. Smart, I thought, but not so useful in this kind of situation. And obviously not doing much as a deterrent either. She also explained that they switched off the floodlight because a bunch of local cats used to think it was hilarious to set it off all through the night. And although you couldn't tell from the living room due to all the indoor lights, it wasn't so fun from the upstairs rooms when it went off every 10 minutes and you were trying to sleep. The next day, my father decided it was time he replaced the camera, just in case anything like that happened again. He opted for one with infrared, so that you still get a decent view of the garden and street at night. He installed it, hooked it up to a DVR, and set it running from that night onwards. The thing was tiny, barely noticeable from the street, and on the opposite side of the house to the huge, obvious older camera housing. Again around 11 p.m. on night 2, there was another loud thud against the front window. This time me and my father went out to investigate. Again, nothing there except a pile of broken apart rocks and dirt which had been balled up and thrown. We went back inside, rewound the DVR by 5 minutes or so, and watched. Into view strolled the guy in a hoodie, with the hood pulled up to obscure his face. He walked parallel to the house until he was directly opposite the window and stopped. He turned to face the window and just stood there, staring at the closed blinds for a good 30 seconds. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out what we assumed was the clump of dirt, threw it, and sprinted for the tree line opposite. We couldn't see how far in he went, but he slowed down just before dropping out of sight, so we assumed he was still there when we came outside, watching. As I said, my parents dealt with this kind of crap from local kids for a long time, and they naturally assumed that's what they were dealing with again. One of the kids, no longer a kid but an adult who hadn't done much growing up, still occasionally yelled things at them in the street, so he was prime suspect. They agreed to switch the floodlight back on as an extra deterrent. The next day, my father dropped into the local police station and asked their advice on what had happened. Since there was no real damage done, after a quick scrub the windows were as good as new, and the footage didn't capture a face, they said there was nothing they could do but advised him to monitor the situation and come back if things escalated. That night, 11 p.m. came and went, and nothing. I remember my mother making a comment to the effect of being glad that whoever it was had obviously got bored and found something more interesting to do. Satisfied that nothing was going to happen, I had a quick cigarette at the front door, scanning the tree line as best I could through the darkness just in case, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up early and looked out of the bedroom window to the front garden. The gate leading to the steps was wide open, and I couldn't remember if it had been the night before. My mother was obsessed with it being kept closed and always complained about the postman leaving it open, so I assumed he must have done it. When I got downstairs, there was no post waiting on the doormat. Not exactly damning evidence of anything, but it prompted me to check the DVR. I rewound it a couple of hours, and the whole time, the gate was open, but no postman, or anyone else for that matter. I kept going. 4 a.m., 2 a.m., midnight, open the whole time. As I rewound it all the way to 11 p.m. the night before, I saw a flurry of rapid movement on the recording. I played from 11 p.m. The gate was closed. Around 11:15 p.m., a pair of headlights came around the corner at the end of the street, and a large white van slowly pulled into view. It slowed more and more until it got level with the house and stopped, Out of it climbed the guy in the hoodie, again with the hood pulled up to cover his face. He reached across to the passenger seat and pulled out a heavy-looking bat, going off how it dropped as he slid it out of the van. Gently closed the van door and walked straight for the front gate. He lifted the gate slowly from its catch and swung it open, making sure it didn't hit anything. Then he took a few steps down towards the door. Cautiously, he stopped, looked around to make sure nobody was coming, and took a few more steps. Again he stopped, checked, and was obviously satisfied that he wasn't going to be confronted. Unfortunately for him, he took one more step and reached the halfway point on the stairs. On went the floodlight, lighting up the garden and our unwelcome guest. He froze again, clearly unsure what to do. Then he looked down at the bag in his hand and turned his face up to look directly into the camera lens. The angle of both the floodlight and the camera meant I got a good look at just the bottom half of his face, and the big grin plastered all over it. And just like that, he turned around, strolled back up the steps, and got into his van. With him gone, the floodlight switched itself off again. Except he didn't leave. I watched the headlights get smaller as he reversed back the way he came and stopped at the end of the street just within view. Then he turned off the engine and waited. At this point, I'd totally forgotten the sequence of events from the previous night and felt a shot of ice go down my back when I saw a sliver of light appear as I opened the door and stepped just outside of it for a cigarette. I stood there, obviously scanning the trees in front of me, while 50 yards to my left, this guy sat watching. I disappeared back inside. A few minutes passed, and the headlights flashed back to life, growing closer again. The van appeared behind them, crawling back towards the house. It got right outside again, stopped for just a second, and then pulled away out of shot. Understandably freaked out, I told my parents and asked my father to go back to the police and tell them that we now had a trespasser. He did. Their response? That it was probably just somebody looking for directions, and in any event, without any way of getting an ID, at no point were the van's license plates clearly visible enough to read because of the headlights. It would be a waste of their time. They didn't even want to see the footage. Nice. We monitored the CCTV for the weeks I was there afterwards, but our nighttime visitor never came back. No idea what he wanted, why he was watching the house, testing our reactions, came calling when he knew we were all home, or why he specifically targeted us in a row of terraced properties. But after getting a look at that smile, I'm glad I didn't decide to go for a smoke a few minutes earlier that night. So, creepy trespasser, let's not meet. Just to preempt any requests, I saw my parents today, and the footage has been overwritten. They keep the recording going 24/7 now, and the DVR only has so much space. Sorry. This happened about 5 years ago to a very close friend and I. I will try my best to get this out as coherently as possible. I live just outside of a small village in Canada. When I say small, I mean blink and you will miss it. So I was used to quiet nights, broken by the sound of coyotes and crickets. When I was 19, going on 20, I ended up going to university in Toronto. It was such a huge change for me, as I wasn't used to having so many people around me all the time. I moved into residence as my village was far enough away that I wasn't able to commute at all. Now, the residence was huge. There were 3 buildings with many floors. You needed your room card to get through the front door, past the reception desk. Your friends needed to sign out a pass in order to visit. And even then, you couldn't visit for more than a few days at a time. I met my best friend, Sarah, a couple of months after moving in, and we became inseparable. We were always at the other person's dorm room, laughing and having fun. I lived a floor above her. Nothing weird happened straight off the bat, but it didn't take long for the two of us to start to notice things. I remember hanging out in her room one night, having a few drinks and watching some TV. We got to talking about creepy things, and that's when she told me that she thought someone was looking into her room at night. She lives on the ground floor. This freaked me out. And when I told her so, she just kind of shrugged and told me that she couldn't be sure. It could just be someone walking out on the path or something. I'm sure it's nothing. She wouldn't hear otherwise about the topic. About a week later, we were again in her room. Her TV was in front of her window at the end of her bed, which we were sitting on. I remember the light was off and we were laughing about something or other when she suddenly sat up, staring at the window. "What is it, Sarah?" "Shh." She turned down her TV and ran for the window, yanking back the curtains. I watched her relax a bit and give me a nervous grin. I thought I saw someone looking in my window. I must be getting paranoid, huh? She laughed and settled back on her bed. "Maybe we should tell the RA?" I asked. She shot that down, telling me that there was no proof and she didn't want to seem crazy. You know, first time away from home, jumping at every little shadow. Now, a little backstory on the view outside her window. When you look out, you can see a bit of an open area before a slope down. The window was small enough that you couldn't see much on either side. It would be easy to hide from someone looking out. I remember thinking that time and again. This happened on and off for a few weeks until finally, we got some proof. I remember walking into her room. She had told me that she needed to show me something, wondering what she needed me for. She pulled back her curtains and said that now she knew that someone was looking in her window. You could clearly see where someone licked her window, right where the curtains meet in the middle, with a nose print right above it. I flipped. We called the RA, who seemed deeply disturbed by this. He said that they would do everything they could to figure it out, but to keep the curtains closed and to immediately report any other incidents. From there, it seemed to get more frequent and creepier at the same time. There were footprints right outside her window during winter, or right after it rained. We would find full-on handprints and food wrappers littering outside. It jumped from one spot where the person licked the window to multiple. It got so bad that she was afraid to be alone. She would spend as much time outside of her dorm room as she could, only using the room to sleep in. She refused to keep her window open while she slept, afraid that whoever it was would cut the screen and force themselves inside. I would sometimes sleep in her room, and we would wake up just to see if anything happened. it wasn't unusual for stuff to happen while I was there too. I remember the ground floor calling a meeting, telling the others that there was a peeping Tom harassing one of the residents, her, and that if it was happening to anyone else, they needed to come forward. We found out later that Sarah wasn't the only one. She ended up leaving right after second semester started, not for this reason. And I wasn't friends with anyone else on the floor below me, so I don't know if it kept happening. No one was caught. What I remember the most about this entire experience was the feeling of constantly being watched and never really feeling safe. It really creeped me out and opened my eyes to the fact that this can happen to anyone. So, dude who creeped on me and my friend through her window, let's not meet. Edit. Okay, so apparently a peeping Tom was arrested that same year I was there. But I don't think it was him. I'm going to do some more digging in the morning and maybe update it if I find anything. I moved abroad for work some years ago. I've had a variety of housemates during this time. Some were great, some were okay, and a few bad apples. My most recent flatmate, however, was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Penny. She had posted an ad looking for female working flatmates and lived in a luxury apartment. I live in a developing country in Asia, in its capital city, which is notorious for its difficult housing market, among many other things. It is not advisable for girls to live alone as a safety precaution. Also factor in that I'm alone in this country and rely heavily on a secure and comfortable living situation. Back to the story. I responded to Penny's advert looking for flatmates for sublet and arranged to see the place. It was a nice apartment with a reasonable rental price. Penny seemed nice enough. She said she was a lawyer and was looking for non-intrusive and responsible people to live with. I was looking for the same and thought it was a great place. I took the room and moved in the following month. Penny had some issues with another flatmate, which culminated in Penny locking the girl outside of our apartment and police being called. The departed flatmate told me that Penny would randomly text her abuse in the middle of the night with the strangest insults. Things like, "You have crap taste and are so old, honey," and "My dog has more talent than you." Alarm bells were ringing, but I believed Penny when she told me the girl had not paid rent and was threatening to ransack the place. Plus, I had nowhere to go as I had secured this room already. So I am living alone with Penny and a 20-year-old girl who had been employed by Penny's family to live with their daughter as a maid. The first week was fine. I realized, however, that Penny wasn't a lawyer and that she was actually unemployed. She would lie about going to work, how her day was, and what she ate during her lunch break at this non-existent job. I knew she was lying because the maid told me that Penny was strange and never left the apartment. I let it go, figured that she may be embarrassed of being unemployed. Penny had no idea I could communicate with the maid, as she was unaware I could speak the local language. When I found out the maid was completely illiterate, I told Penny I'd be teaching her how to read. Penny told me that there was no point because the maid wouldn't be interested, as poor people supposedly have no respect for education, and to not teach her anything because being literate wouldn't improve her life anyway. Actually, the maid was interested in learning to read, and I started to teach her. The maid wanted this to be kept secret and hid her notebook and pen during the day inside a box. I strongly believe Penny wanted to keep her illiterate, as she wanted her to be as vulnerable as possible. The maid had left school at 7 years old and had been working full-time since the age of 12, which Penny thought was great, as she learned how to cook very well. In the third week, crazy started. Penny presented me with a food bill, saying she'd ordered $300 worth of food for us. This was untrue, and I said I wouldn't be paying her. A weekly shop here is around $15. She would also hang around outside my room, wanting to talk before I left for work in the mornings, and then do the same in the evenings. I thought she was a lonely girl and felt sorry for her. She'd literally follow me to my bedroom door and keep talking until it was shut in her face. She talked to me for around 40 minutes at a time, uninterrupted, as if she was talking to herself. I could rarely get a word in. She appeared very unaware of social etiquette and thought it normal to have a conversation where she was the only one speaking to the point of breathlessness. She texted me while I was at work, saying things like, "We need to talk this evening," about apartment stuff. One day we had a drink and she told me many things. That she was extremely academically gifted, had traveled the world, was related to the royal family, had a wardrobe worth thousands, and also that her boyfriend had died last year. I found out her ex-boyfriend was actually alive, but figured this was her way of dealing with a bad breakup. The rest of her story were lies. Actually, 90% of what she'd say was untrue. She'd lie about trivial things, which convinced me she had a personality disorder. I'd come back from work and she'd tell me that she'd arrived 1 hour before me and was having a nap, even though she just spent the whole day asleep after taking various substances. Penny's mother often rang the maid. Penny's family lived in a city a few hours away. To find out what Penny was doing, and she'd send Penny's cousin round every few weeks to check on her. During this time, Penny would also lie to them that she had a job and that I was her close friend. Thinking of this freaks me out because I generally avoid her if I could at this point. However, her family seemed to know a lot about me in the space of a few weeks. She clearly concocted a story about me to her family. I guess as the weeks went by, she became comfortable and started being more herself. She would sleep all day and be awake during the night. She'd drink up to 3 bottles of whiskey per week, mixing with various medications she was taking. The maid told me all of this as she was cleaning Penny's room. Penny also claimed not to know how old she was. Penny treated the maid very badly. The maid was not allowed to speak to anyone or go out in public or eat properly. She was expected to eat small portions and leftovers. I'd take her out often for a snack or ice cream, which is when she'd tell me about strange Penny. I was told the maid was earning $150 per month. A low wage by Western standards, but normal in this country. Penny included my share of this in my rent, so I was contributing $75 to her salary. I later found out that her wage was only $85, so Penny was knowingly giving this maid $10 a month to work for her full-time, from 10 a.m. to 1 a.m. working hours. She once berated her terribly for going to sleep at 1 a.m. and woke her up demanding she cook for her. Penny reasoned that poor people needed to be kept in check and that they weren't normal people. Penny had a pet dog, who she seemed obsessed with and would spend hundreds of dollars weekly on him. She was paying $10 for her maid and $400 for her dog. In my 5 weeks there, that dog rarely left her bedroom. He would shit all over her bed and piss on her mattress. When she was questioned about the piss stain, she said it was water. It definitely wasn't. I thought she was engaging in bestiality, and that the maid confided that she too thought Penny was indeed engaging in sexual relations with the dog. Her dog would also randomly piss in the common areas, and on one occasion, Penny came out of her room and stood in the piss with her bare feet. She seemed totally unbothered by it. She also claimed the dog could speak to her. Penny would also eat my food often and then deny it, offering the explanation that it could be a ghost. Conversely, she'd claim that she was often starving because she had no access to food, even though she binged daily. I questioned her about my missing food, and she'd scream that she had no idea where it went, and I shouldn't use the fridge. The fact that she believed in her own delusions seriously freaked me out. She claimed that her friends used to live with her, even though I found no evidence of her ever living with others in that place. She hated for other girls to be described as attractive, as she was severely overweight and never showered. Her hair was knotted as she hadn't washed it in months. She'd also have the maid massage her often. On the occasions that she'd leave her door open, I'd see her sitting in bed gawking at TV and eating or drinking. She also seemed out of breath very often. I had no idea why, because she never did anything active. During my time in that apartment, Penny never left the apartment building once. She just had her routine of sleeping, eating, drinking, and taking pills. She'd often pretend she'd gone somewhere. On a few occasions, she'd turn the lights and TV off in her room and stay silent for a few hours to make me believe she was out. She even made up an elaborate lie that she was taking some exams and pretended to be stressed on the day, even though she never actually had any exams. She seemed to include details in her lies to make them more realistic. It scared me that she did this so naturally. She displayed bouts of mania where she'd spend hundreds of dollars on decorations, like plastic flowers and small figurines, and she'd be up at 5 a.m. decorating the common areas. She did this routine several times. I'd hear her often during the night, pacing back and forth down the hallway in the apartment. She claimed she was decorating the place for all her friends to enjoy, even though no one would come to see her, aside from the cousin. In week 5 of me living there, I heard screaming and shouting one evening. I thought Penny was on the phone, so I ignored it. I then received a hysterical phone call from the maid saying Penny accused her of stealing something and was going to beat her. So she ran to her room. I asked Penny what happened, and she said that the maid had a bad attitude and started crying for no reason. She said she'd just done some difficult exams, not true, had been stressed and wanted to chill, not deal with the rude maid. That night, Penny also severely verbally abused the maid for refusing to come and take more abuse. I heard Penny make a phone call to the maid, in which she screamed the following: "Useless rude bitch. What are you doing relaxing in your room? I want a drink. Bring it to me now. Useless bitch, I'm ill and I need my drink. I'm too ill to get it myself. Penny was not ill, and the drink in question had been left on the kitchen counter. Penny wanted the maid to deliver it to her in bed. I saw the maid later that night to give her some dinner. Her eyes were red from crying and she was shaking. The same night, the maid told me she wanted to leave the next day because she was sure she'd be severely beaten soon, although she had no idea how to leave, as she was illiterate and relied on Penny's family for her travel arrangement. The maid told me she had called Penny's parents and told them what happened, and they told her not to leave, but she refused. She then said to me, "Her parents don't care about me. Why should I stay? To die? I don't want to die here." She asked that I not leave her alone with Penny until she left. That night I feared for my own safety. I was awoken during the night by Penny slamming doors and running around. She was high and intoxicated, and had likely gone to the maid's bedroom in an attempt to hurt her, although she couldn't gain entry. The next day came, and the maid had packed her 3 bags. Penny's mother rang the maid and instructed her to go and cook lunch for Penny. Penny burst out of her room as soon as she heard her in the kitchen, and all hell broke loose. Penny was screaming and told the maid she was nothing but an uneducated village girl who was not a princess and should never dare to defy her, that she shouldn't even make certain facial expressions in her presence. Penny held the power, and she was going to call the police to come and arrest the maid. She carried on abusing her while I tried to intervene. Of course, Penny wanted to keep the maid working and had her scrub the floors right up until she needed to leave. Penny said to me, "Can you believe this fucking bitch is trying to leave? Leaving me without a maid?" I was both scared and speechless. Before the maid left, Penny insisted on checking the maid's belongings for supposedly stolen items. We went outside the apartment where Penny emptied the maid's 3 bags, including her underwear and food, onto the road, removing various items she claimed were hers. She called the maid a whore and accused her of fucking around, which is very taboo here. Penny even attempted to take away a gift that I had given the maid. I gave her this gift, as she told me she'd never had a birthday gift in her life. I can only describe it as the denigration of one human by another. Penny's parents kept calling throughout the day, begging the maid to continue living with their daughter. They did this as they heard their daughter's level of disturbing abuse. To execute their plan, they told her they couldn't book her a ticket home and that she'd have to stay. After she tells them she's being abused. What the fuck? Luckily, and with my help, the maid and I arranged for her fiancé to collect her. I have no doubt she would have severely beaten the maid had I not been present. That day, I decided to move out and left 2 days later, stressed and disturbed from witnessing the above. I hadn't seen Penny since the maid left, as she locked herself in her room. The night before I was leaving, I went to tell her I'd be moving out. I knocked on her door every hour for the whole evening, knowing she was inside. She pretended to be out again and turned her lights off, although I heard her dog barking. The next morning I saw her, and she said that her friends had taken her out to cheer her up after what the maid did to her. She said that she knew I'd been knocking on her door because the dog had panicked and knocked over his water bowl, causing Penny to slip and injure herself when she returned. She'd concocted this version of events to tell me. 2 days after leaving, I received a phone call from Penny's mother, who was worried she couldn't contact her daughter. Penny would do this often, as if she wanted her family to think she was dead. I found out that her mother immediately flew into the city, checked whether her daughter was alive or not, then left. In this country, some view mental illness as taboo. So while Penny's family are aware of their daughter's fragile mental state, they do nothing. I assume they enable her because they do not want to deal with her. They allowed her to abuse a vulnerable girl from a poor family in the process, knowing the maid would have no option but to endure abuse. I assume another vulnerable girl has now been sent to live with Penny, and is probably trapped, as the other young girl had been. Penny also continues to advertise her apartment, looking for people to live with. I hope I never see her again, and hope that other prospective housemates see beyond her act of normalcy that she put on when I first met her. Edit. I don't want this story to be taken as a reflection of the country it occurred in. I have only given some country information to provide a little context to the story. This story is primarily about what occurred in that apartment, and should not be taken to suggest otherwise. For this reason, I've omitted the country name. I've also added some additional parts to this story, which I remembered after submission. Edit 2. What happened after I left? Over a week after I moved out, Penny still hadn't returned my deposit. I was calling and texting her daily, and she'd ignore me. She responded once, claiming her friends had taken her to stay with them, as they didn't want her to be alone. Of course, she hadn't left the apartment at all, and was lying again. I know this because the apartment security told me. I woke up one day to around 20 to 25 messages from her, sent in succession, stating that she'd been waiting all week for me to come back, and that I was crazy, and she had been trying to contact me daily. What the fuck? I have no idea why she thought I'd be returning. Finally, a friend of mine arranged to collect my money from her. I couldn't deal anymore. Penny told my friend that I should come at 10 p.m. I do not know what she was planning to do. I notified local police, and I was concerned something may happen. My friend went up to her dark apartment. All lights were off, and she was in there, telling him for an hour how psychotic I was, as if having a conversation with herself, and speaking until she was breathless. She gave him part of my deposit, and told him her friends were coming to pick her up, and that he should leave now. A while back, I wanted to get back into the job market after being self-employed for a couple of years. I'm a female and in my late 20s, specializing in journalism and media in a time when magazines are shutting down. Safe to say that the usual question for each interview involved trying to find out if I plan on having kids. But obviously not outright asking, because that is illegal. Although one person actually did. Anyway, I was having a hard time finding anything that wasn't going to take me back to junior level, and feeling pretty bummed out. I started to look for jobs away from the major sites, and more in the classified sections, Craigslist. Mostly just to see what's out there. One day, I spotted an ad for a social media manager, digital marketer, for a company that looked interesting. something to do with building props for theatre and movie productions. I can do this, I said, and put together a professional proposal and sent off my CV. Got a return email pretty quick, and the guy sounded pretty gruff but assertive. I tried to give him a call, but he wouldn't answer the phone. On email, he was all fine, asking about my credentials. We arranged for a meeting at the warehouse office. On the day, I printed out my proposal, jumped in an Uber, and headed out to the address on his email signature. It was businessy looking. No reason to suspect anything at this point. We start heading out to the super industrial side of town. Again, no big deal. I assume this is because of the warehouse to store the props. I get dropped off at this decrepit looking warehouse at the end of a street. I told the cab not to wait, but seriously regretted it afterwards. The place was empty, and I wanted to walk around the back to see if anyone was there. But the hairs on the back of my neck were up, and I just didn't feel like it was a wise thing to do. I stood out the front with my laptop and my proposal. The time to meet went past 5 minutes. I texted the guy, no response. 20 minutes, I text to no reply. Tried to call multiple times. Then I finally get a text saying, "Hey, where are you?" "I'm here at the address on your email signature." "Oh, we've moved. I'm in a meeting now, but I'll send one of my boys to come pick you up." At this point, I should have been more freaked out that he was sending a random guy to pick me up. But at the time, I was more concerned with how unprofessional this guy was. Call it desperation or rose-colored glasses. I agreed to wait for the guy, but my senses kicked in right after I hung up. What the hell was I doing waiting to get picked up by a random guy to get taken for a meeting at a new location? So odd and bizarre. At this point, I should say that I did ask for a coffee meeting somewhere, but I remember he said he was super busy on a campaign. And anyway, he said I needed to see the warehouse. After a minute, I text him and say, "I'm sorry, I just don't feel comfortable getting into a strange car. Let me know when you're free to reschedule a meeting somewhere between both of us." I go home and relay the story to my husband. Hours later, I get a series of texts that are so incredibly bizarre. I'll retell them as they came through. From him, my name. "I am very disappointed that you didn't turn up to our meeting today, and I expected you to be more professional. Good luck with your career." From me, taken aback because I pride myself on being professional. "I turned up to the address listed for your business on your signature. I was on time. I tried to contact you multiple times after you didn't turn up. I imagine many women would feel uncomfortable getting into a stranger's car." Minutes go by. From him, "I was happy to give you a chance, and you blew it. Going to need all the luck in the world." I was like, what the fuck? Why am I in this bizarre abusive text chain with a potential employer that wouldn't meet me or talk on the phone? So I give up even trying to reason with him. An hour later or so, I, no joke, get a text saying, "By the way, part of your job was to change the email signature to the new address." So weird potential boss who may or may not have been trying to lure women into his creepy warehouses with the promise of an illustrious social media job. Let's not meet. Sometimes I still wonder if I did something wrong to deserve the abuse from this random. I grew up in a sheltered household, where my parents were overprotective and always cautioned me to be wary of everything around me. It would range from not letting me stay at my friend's house for a sleepover due to fear of me getting raped by their dad, to not letting me shop with my friends by ourselves unless there was a parent supervising us the entire time. They would also warn me about strangers, kidnappers, stalkers, etc. Note, I understand that these things are very much valid concerns in society, but I was young and thought these dangers were few and far in between in my country. Dad gave me this whole spiel, and they explained that one of the reasons why they warned me repeatedly was because I look very young for my age, and people may think I'm gullible and an easy target. It also doesn't help that I was 5'2" then, and at the height of a child. I started to tone them out after a while, which was a pretty stupid idea on my part. I'll explain why in a little bit. This occurrence happened in the summer of me transitioning from a freshman to sophomore in high school. It was about 8:30 p.m. and the sun was setting, but it was still fairly bright outside. It was bright enough that the streetlights weren't lit, and the cars on the road didn't need to have their evening headlights on to see properly. My sibling and I used to go to a tutoring center, which was smack dab in the middle of a residential area. Since we'd been frequenting the center at the same location for years, and the neighborhood seemed relatively nice and family friendly, I thought I'd just take a stroll around the residential area as I waited for my sibling to finish up their weekly test. Our dad would pick up both of us after we were finished our tests and head home, as it would be more efficient to just do one trip instead of two, as my house was a bit of a ways away. I almost always finished my tests sooner than my sibling did, so oftentimes I'd have a lot of spare time to wait. I'd usually have a book with me, but that week I didn't, so I opted for the stroll. This area has a nice playground that's usually frequented by families and their children, toddlers really, which was why I thought it'd be safe for a 16-year-old to be walking around by themselves. I mean, parents wouldn't want their toddlers in a playground that would be slightly dangerous, right? I knew the neighborhood fairly well, so I started walking by myself around the block, and as I walked past the playground, thought I'd call one of my friends to chat about something fairly insignificant in our lives. I had planned that I would only walk half a block before turning back, because I remembered my parents' warnings about how people will just randomly stalk children because reasons, and I should try to remain in a more populated area. I should also look over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me, as an additional safety measure. I thought this time, because it was still bright out, and as I was on the phone with somebody who will know if I go missing, I'll ignore their advice and do my own thing. But I shouldn't have. I got caught up in the phone call I had made, and before I knew it, I'd walked a good couple blocks from the tutoring center. I whirled around and planned to head back the way I came before I saw a man, about 5'6" to 5'8", with a shock of white greyish hair, standing about 10 feet from me, dressed in a forest green windbreaker, baggy blue jeans, and some brown shoes. I would not have noticed anything strange had he, 1, not just abruptly stopped and stared straight at me, 2, veered straight into a throng of evergreen trees next to a bunch of townhouses to his left, my right, so I couldn't see his face anymore, and 3, his face was as red as a tomato. My friend on the phone was asking me if everything was okay because I literally stopped talking due to my surprise. I quietly said that I had to go because something didn't quite feel right with what I'd just seen. In hindsight, probably shouldn't have done that, stayed standing there for a minute or two, facing the direction from where I came from, trying to see if the guy who just abruptly stopped when he saw me look at him had entered one of the townhouses. I wanted to confirm that maybe my paranoia was playing tricks on me, and that he was actually just a resident of one of the townhouses in that strip. But then I noticed it peeking out from beneath the evergreens were his brown shoes with the baggy blue jeans spilling over them, and they weren't moving. He was still facing me behind the cover of the trees, and even though I couldn't see his face behind them, I could feel his eyes on me. And it was disconcerting. To make matters worse, on the opposite side of the street from the townhouses was an apartment complex, and two men had just exited it and were jaywalking across the street to where I was then standing. Starting to get scared shitless, thinking that all three of these men were in on trying to kidnap me or worse. I quickly turned around and started walking real fast towards the intersection, about another block from where I was. I flipped my brick phone open. Nokia, I swear. Sped dialed my house number and hoped that my dad hadn't gone out of the house to pick up my sibling and I at the tutoring center yet, as he did not have a cell phone back then. When my dad picked up, I was already at the intersection where all these cars were bustling by. This intersection was at a main street. I was so relieved and started blurting out how happy I was I managed to catch him before he had left the house, and how I wanted to get picked up at the 7-Eleven a couple blocks away from the tutoring center. He didn't ask any questions, aside from whether or not my sibling was still at the tutoring center, and I had said yes. He picked me up in record time, and that's why I was at a 7-Eleven instead of at the tutoring center like I should be, and why I couldn't have just walked back. I then told him how there was this middle-aged guy who suddenly stopped and stared at me when I turned around to try to walk back to the center, who then beelined it for the trees to cover himself when I spotted him. I mentioned how my body was telling me it was all shades of wrong to walk past this guy, so I booked it to 7-Eleven to be around somewhere safer with surveillance cameras. My dad was livid and demanded to know if I saw where this guy had walked off to. I said no, and my dad started driving around the neighborhood as we still had some time to kill before picking up my sibling. When we drove past a shopping area close to my neighborhood, I spotted the guy walking in the direction of the liquor store, but kept my mouth shut. I don't know why I didn't tell my dad that the guy was right there as we circled the area in our car, but I was afraid that maybe I had made a big deal out of nothing, and maybe the guy wasn't actually going to do something bad and was just a weirdo. Whatever it was, it definitely taught me to look behind me every few seconds when I'm walking by myself in broad daylight, and especially at nighttime.